Since this is our first Sunday of the new year, it seems like a good time to remind you all of a few basics. First, this is a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and I am a Unitarian Universalist minister. Unitarian Universalism is a religion that does not require anyone to agree to a creed, a set of specific beliefs, to be a member. Nor do we have a canon, a set of particular scriptures that define our faith. If anything, we have an unlimited canon of writings, speeches, music, and art, both ancient and modern, that any of us might consider spiritually meaningful. Rather than creed or canon, what holds us together is covenant, a set of promises that we choose and make to one another about how we will be together. As members of this congregation, we have a covenant that we made a little over a year ago. And as a member of the Unitarian Universalist Association, we and other UU congregations have a covenant that is about 40 years old, though by this time next year, we may have adopted a brand new 21st century UUA covenant too. Unitarian Universalism has officially existed since the UU Association was created in 1961, but it didn't come out of nowhere. On one side, the Universalist Church of America was organized in 1866, though a precursor had existed since 1797. The first Universalist church in America was founded in Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1779, and as many of you know, we have the miracle story of Minister John Murray preaching to Universalists in New Jersey in 1770. On the other side, the American Unitarian Association was organized in 1825, largely as a result of Minister William Ellery Channing claiming the name Unitarian in a sermon in 1819. The oldest Pilgrim Church became Unitarian in 1802. And older roots go back to the 17th century, and in particular, the adoption of the Cambridge Platform as a covenant between the New England Congregationalists in 1648. Comparing with our closest cousins in faith, the United Church of Christ was organized in 1957, with its Congregationalist core also going back to the Cambridge Platform. And the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, was organized in 1968, though the church actually dates back to the early 19th century. Neither has an official creed, but they both have a canon, namely the Bible. Unitarian Universalism has a rich history. From the earliest days of Christianity, when both belief in the humanity of Jesus, and thus the unity of God, and belief in universal salvation, that all souls go to paradise, were deemed heresy, though through the emergence of Unitarianism and Universalism as distinct Christian faiths in Europe and then in the United States. Then there were religious and social movements, such as transcendentalism, abolition, temperance, women's suffrage, and humanism, that broadened both faiths beyond Christianity, then beyond theism, and allowed for our modern pluralist religion. There was the Unitarian Service Committee in the 1940s that gave us the chalice, the flaming chalice symbol, and the fellowship movement in the 1950s that birthed this congregation, and also the merger of the American Unitarian Youth and the Universalist Youth Fellowship that pretty much led to the organization of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. Then there was our participation in the civil rights movement and the murder of UU Minister James Reeb that was a catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. There was our publication of the Pentagon Papers that helped end the Vietnam War. There was our partnership with the historically Unitarian churches in Transylvania after the Romanian Revolution. There was our publication with the United Church of Christ of the comprehensive series of scientifically accurate, age-appropriate sexuality education curricula called Our Whole Lives. There was our push for the legal recognition of same-sex marriage that led to marriage equality first in Massachusetts and then across the nation. There was our protest of Arizona's anti-immigrant SB 1070, so visible in our yellow Side with Love t-shirts and leading to our nickname as the Love People. Unitarian Universalism has a rich history, a wealth of stories, a wide gallery of people whose lives we celebrate or can at least take as cautionary tales, and a deep covenantal theology of love, justice, and interdependence that informs our living in community with one another and offers a saving message for the world beyond our walls. Given this, put simply, what I preach on Sunday mornings is Unitarian Universalism. I know that surprises some people, but this is a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and I am a Unitarian Universalist minister. Would we expect a Christian pastor in a church not to preach Christianity? Would we expect a rabbi in a synagogue not to preach Judaism, or an imam in a mosque not to preach Islam? No, we wouldn't. So this morning, I'll be preaching Unitarian Universalism on the subject of keeping our promises, which is not only an important part of our faith, but also an important part of being human. For now, though, let's sing. I once kept track of all the promises I made in the course of about a week. There were a lot of them. None of them were major promises of the order of, say, wedding vows, but I was still surprised at how many promises I made during one ordinary week. At home, I made promises about errands and cleaning, whether picking up a quart of milk or putting the laundry into the dryer. At work, I made promises about attending particular meetings and submitting reports on specific topics. With friends, I made promises to see them or to call them or to mail them something I thought they might like. With colleagues, I made promises to meet them for lunch or read a book that they'd recommended to me. Not all of these promises were necessarily made to other people. Some of them were things I promised myself I would do. In many cases, though, I knew that keeping my promise was a factor in someone else's reality, affecting their emotional well-being or their ability to do their own work. I realized that I was accountable to those other people, whether they knew of my promises or not. I also realized that I broke my promises more often than I had known, and certainly more often than I liked. Sometimes I had promised something I simply could not deliver due to limited time or ability. Sometimes I was dependent on someone else's promise in order to keep my own. Sometimes I simply forgot, or I rationalized a way to make the promise a low priority out of my own laziness or selfishness, and acknowledging that about myself was often painful. Thankfully, I was in most cases able to renew my promise. Whether by friendship or fortune or grace, I was able to make good on what I'd promised, though not necessarily in the exact terms of the original promise. Forgiveness was an integral part of that, and was sometimes most difficult when I was the one who needed to forgive myself. Jewish philosopher Martin Buber saw this making of promises as essential to human nature. Indeed, he described humans as promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing beings. This is central to the idea of religion, given that it's really about how we relate to one another rather than what we believe as individuals. And it's particularly instructive for Unitarian Universalists, given that we are based in covenant rather than creed. Unitarian Universalism, as I said, traces its basis in covenant back to the Cambridge Platform of 1648, which was essentially a declaration of religious independence by New England's Puritans and their ecclesiastical constitution. Since the late 1990s, UUs have been rediscovering the power of covenant, coming to understand it as the container formed of love and gentleness that can embrace any group of people, including a whole congregation of different people with different beliefs. Every group's covenant will be different, of course, given that it's the set of promises made by that particular group out of the demands and the possibilities of that group's reality. But the spirit of covenant is the same: kindness to one another, to our community, and to our world. Our practice of covenant does have an assumption, though, and that assumption is that we'll make an active effort to keep our promises. After all, there's no point making a covenant if it's only going to be ignored and forgotten by the very people who made it. The power of covenant comes from living into covenant, and that means keeping the promises that we've made. And like most things in our lives, keeping our promises is a skill, or at least a habit, that we need to develop. Starting in the 1970s, there have been experiments to explore the ability of young children to wait. The original marshmallow experiment offered each child a treat, such as a marshmallow, and promised them that if they could wait 15 minutes rather than eating it immediately, then they'd receive a second treat. While most of the children between the ages of 4 and 6 couldn't wait, not surprisingly, a full third of them could resist eating the first marshmallow in order to earn a second. There were also follow-up experiments to see how the children did as they grew up. Those who were better able to wait when they were young, for instance, became teenagers who were more capable, more dependable, and generally better off physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. More recently, there have been experiments to see what affects a child's ability to wait. Given that the children were promised an additional marshmallow if they could wait, one experiment studied the effects of either keeping or breaking that promise when the marshmallow test was then repeated. They found that children who experienced a broken promise were less able to wait, whereas children who experienced a kept promise were able to wait up to 4 times longer. In other words, a child's environment and how much they feel they can trust it makes a difference to both their present behavior and their future expectations, just like the temperament they inherit from their parents. So if children and youth have trustworthy adult role models who keep their promises, then they're more likely to grow up to be trustworthy adults themselves. And for those of us who are adults, even after our brains have stopped developing around the age of 25, we're still more likely to trust someone who has kept their promises. And we're more likely to keep our promises if others trust us to keep them. And that's certainly something we try to foster within Unitarian Universalism. I've been to Salt Lake City twice in my life, and as you know, it's a largely Mormon city. The first time was for an academic conference. I'd been traveling all day, and I was hungry, so after I got to my hotel and checked in, I went to a nearby restaurant to get some food, and I ordered a glass of wine to go with it. The staff took my order, but somewhat apologetically said that I'd need to wait for my drink because it was too early to serve alcohol. As soon as the clock reached the appointed hour, though, they brought it to me. The second time I went to Salt Lake City, I was there for the annual UUA General Assembly. I was with a group of seminary friends that had driven over from Denver, and I was also the responsible adult for one of the youth I knew from Albuquerque. Now, both the youth and their responsible adults at GA had a covenant concerning things we will do and will not do in order to make it a good experience for everyone. And our covenant included a promise not to drink alcohol during our time together. That was fine by me. And in any case, my previous experience in Salt Lake City showed me that it wasn't easy to get a drink there anyway. Only things had changed since I'd been there some years before. Utah was not immune to what was happening elsewhere along the Rockies, and now there were breweries everywhere. They generally had good restaurants too, so most of our meals between the various sessions at General Assembly were at those breweries. And every time I was asked if I wanted a drink, I said no. My friends pointed out that the youth for whom I was responsible wasn't actually with us, and I said that didn't matter. I'd made a promise, my youth trusted me to keep it, and I wanted to keep it. Oh, I felt the peer pressure, and I found new sympathy for those who don't drink, especially if they're in recovery. But by the end of the week, my friends understood that keeping my promise was more important to me, and they respected that. I've since come to understand that since covenant is the essential religious practice of Unitarian Universalism, keeping our promises is something we must practice too. Sometimes we'll fail, of course. We're not perfect. We're flawed and we're fallible, and we do make mistakes. But it's still important to make the effort, especially when we're held in a community of love and gentleness that we trust to make the effort too. I'm going to ask you some wondering questions now, and I'll give you a little time after each to reflect. Marcy will also put each question on the screen as I ask it. I wonder what promises you have made as we begin the new year. I wonder when you have kept a promise in spite of the possible consequences. I wonder which of the promises of our UUFP covenant matters the most to you. I wonder what your own life experiences have taught you about keeping your promises. We're going to take a few minutes now to reflect on keeping our promises, and then Anne will invite us into a time of sharing. You may wish to settle into a comfortable position and perhaps close your eyes. First, if you will, think about a time when you made a promise to someone else. Reflect on what led you to make that promise. Perhaps you kept that promise, or maybe you didn't. Reflect on how it turned out and how you feel about what happened. Now think about a time when someone else made a promise to you. Reflect on what led them to make that promise. Perhaps they kept that promise, or maybe they didn't. Reflect on how it turned out and how you feel about what happened. Finally, think about what these life experiences have taught you about keeping promises. Reflect on what you have learned about keeping your promises. This is going to be an exciting year for our congregation. Whether you were here almost 4 years ago when we voted to look for a new location, or a little over 2 years ago when we held an incredibly successful capital campaign, and during a pandemic too, or a scant 6 weeks ago when we went under contract to buy 326 Tabbs Lane, you know that 2024 will be a big deal for us. And if you found your way to us even more recently than that, welcome. You've joined us at a very exciting time. From the email that UUFP President Beck Wheeler sent out last week, you know what an incredible amount of work the Planning Committee is doing right now. There are only a couple of weeks left to finish our inspections and get answers to our questions raised by the inspection so far. I know that many of you have toured the property already, and I hope that more of you will go look around when more visits are scheduled. Remember that we want every member to have seen 326 Tabbs Lane before we vote to buy it. That vote will likely take place on the last Sunday in February, so please plan to be here on February 25th. It'll also be my last Sunday before I go on sabbatical. Now, as Beck explained, we thought that voting next month would mean we'd close on the purchase in March. But it turns out we're going to have to wait until the city has approved the new property lines, and that could take a while. We won't be able to start on the renovations and upgrades we want until we actually own the property. But the good news is that we'll have more time to properly figure out what we want and how we want to do it, to draw up plans and get quotes from contractors so that once we've closed, we'll be all ready to go. This is all to say that we don't know when we'll be able to move into our new church home. As I said a couple of Sundays ago, I certainly hope that we'll be all moved in by next Christmas. I know that we'll have a big celebration and a fabulous dedication ceremony with plenty of UU friends and non-UU dignitaries and our new neighbors to make it a really special occasion too. But I can't promise that this will have happened by this time next year. And neither can Beck, nor Sandy, nor Jay, nor any other member of the planning committee. There's so much that needs to happen, and so much like the new property lines that is out of our control that we can't even guess at a timeline. And as Michelle's mother would advise us, I really don't like making promises I can't keep. But here's the thing. The fact that we can't promise you when we'll be in our new building doesn't make it any less exciting. As you heard from Anne in her pulpit minute, there's so much potential with 326 Tabbs Lane and way more to do than the planning committee alone can do. So there's a part for everyone to play in making our new church home a reality this year. When it comes to realizing our vision, we're only limited by our imaginations. So when the time comes, I hope that each of you will promise to do your part. And then, as the good UUs I know you are, make every effort to keep your promises too. May it be so.